So the earliest forms of this piece were as a written article, uh, but every time I tried to write it, I realized that my tone wasn't really as clear as I wanted it to be. So I decided to do this one as a video because I want you to really understand not just what I'm saying, but the feeling that I intend with it. So let's talk about the idea of curated content. What does it mean to be curated? Now, the word curation is a pretty recent back formation from the word curator, which is an old word from the late Middle Ages. It looks like, and we don't really end up with our current sense of curating things which are not museums, curating content until really the earliest use I can find of that is 1982, I think, is the Oxford English Dictionary has an early use of it then, but certainly doesn't go back. Like when I was a really young child, no one used this. And even then, that was a kind of one-off use of it. It doesn't pick up steam for a while. But today, I think we generally have a positive view of the idea of curated content, things that are curated. All you got to do is go online and see any kind of online service or subscription box or something. They brag about how it's curated and how everything needs to be hand selected in some way for you. And I understand why that is a thing which we would desire. I use a lot of things which really curate all sorts of content and other things for me. But I've become convinced, and this is going to sound like an overly bold statement, but I do mean this. I've become convinced that curating self-curated content is one of, if not the most dangerous thing to our society at the moment. Now that's a big statement, and in fact, that statement there is why I felt like I needed to make this a video, because every time I wrote it, it felt clickbaity, or it felt like I was overstating something just for the sake of hyperbole. But I legitimately mean this. So let's go back in time a little bit to the days when Amazon was, besides being a rainforest, was just an online bookseller. They weren't selling every other thing. And I became really interested in Amazon's recommendations. They had a little something, they would have a little thing say, we have some recommendations for you. And I was really enjoying their recommendations, but I realized that I was not browsing books that they didn't recommend. And I wondered what that was doing to my intellectual development. And so I wrote a little short story called We Have Some Recommendations for You. And I wrote the first draft. And in the first draft, it begins with the main character using this and really becoming enamored of this kind of product. And in the end, this character, it takes place in the wedding of this character, where this character is, I think his name was Will, it doesn't matter, was at his wedding in a church that he selected using an online, AI to find one that most closely fit his beliefs, a spouse who was selected for him through a computer program. Well, I put it away for 6 months and picked it back up and dusted it off to try to make it into something. And I realized that in the intervening time, what I had predicted as dystopia had actually happened. And so the idea that today, so much of our romantic lives, our friends, every bit of our communication is curated for us, and not necessarily by evil tech giants with bad intent. Now, I know there's been a lot of controversy about censorship by tech giants in the I think in the popular world, the question is, are tech giants censoring voices they don't like? I think in the academic world, it's It's why aren't they censoring more? We don't like the voices they're not censoring well enough. So I'm pretty convinced it's occurring, but it doesn't matter because I actually think that is less of a threat. The bigger threat is the way that I will train an artificial intelligence to curate my content for me. Because just like all those years ago, I started seeing that I was getting more and more blinkered in my thinking because I was only reading certain things that were similar to the things that I read before, and everyone was just in agreement with something else. I really started trying to seek out voices that were different than my own, and for me, it was pretty easy. I'm out of step with a lot of the academic world, and this process has made me even more out of step with it. But I've noticed that in the academic world, one of the problems I have sometimes is when I'm talking about a theorist or a philosopher or some kind of thinker who holds views that are similar to mine, most of the time, even academics who are specialists in theory or philosophy have never read them or usually have never heard of them. Whereas I, living in a world which is at odds with what I do, with sort of my own thoughts, I'm very familiar, have read, etc. And so I actually think that makes my thoughts on the subject better. Not because I'm smarter, nor even because the philosophers whom I agree with are right. I think they are, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't agree with them, but not based on their essential rightness, but rather based on the fact that I've had to sharpen my thoughts, have had to say, well, there's a really good objectionist thought in what other people are saying. But most of my colleagues, they don't have that opportunity because they all live in a very kind of intellectually, I mean, they all live in a very tight intellectual space. And it's not just here. I find it is true all the time. If you go onto social media, whether it's entertainment news or political news or social news, we're all Pauline Kael now. If you don't know who Pauline Kael was very famous New York Times, I think he's a film critic, who famously said, it's a kind of a misquote, but she famously said about the 1972 election, she didn't know how Nixon could have won because she didn't know anyone who voted for him. The actual quote, of course, is not that juicy. It's a little more complicated. She said she only knows one person, and she acknowledges she lives in a very weird world where she doesn't know anyone who voted for the guy who won the election. But I think it's probably true that many people out there, because of their self-curation, they don't know people who are on other sides of not just political issues, but social issues. They don't know what's going on in terms of culture, in terms of the way other people live. You'll see people saying all the time, I don't know why anyone has to do X. And X is something which tens of millions of people do all the time. Those tens of millions of people could tell them in seconds why they have to do them, but they literally never heard their voices. They never seen them. They've never experienced them. And so because of this, our view of the world is becoming more and more constricted. We're all becoming Pauline Kael, where we literally don't know the people who don't already agree with us, and not just know them in our own families and worlds, but know them otherwise. And so, social media is going to recommend friends to us, people to date, people to marry. The thing about going to a church, there are AIs and little quizzes out there that will, there are some fun ones too, but there are ones that will tell you where you should be going to church and who you should be thinking about, and what podcasts you should listen to that already agree with what you have to say and just give a more nuanced view of it. And so the end result is that we lack empathy for one another. We don't understand one another, And so when someone else is hurting because of a situation, we ascribe their hurt either to their fragility, we call them snowflakes, or we talk about white fragility, or whatever the thing is, like they're fragile, they're too sensitive. Or we say, well, they are a bad person, they're evil, they're wicked, because I don't know anyone who agrees with that. Only a stupid person or crazy person would think that. It's interesting in terms of like how I'm a very resilient person. And because of but I know that I'm out of the average, but still I can't help but put my own sensitivity as the zero mark, and anyone who's any more sensitive to me is too sensitive, and anyone who's any less sensitive than me is completely sociopathic, unsensitive, right? Like everyone else, I see myself as the kind of the norm, and that's not good. And so it's always important to seek out other views so that we can empathize with people, so we can have them in our lives, so we can learn to understand them and learn to love them. Fortunately, the one place where we really don't have this quite so much anymore, or quite so much as we do elsewhere, we still have it, is in our families. Now, of course, the very nature of family means demographically they're going to be very similar to you, right? Similar social class, they're from the same country as you probably, they, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we can come up with examples of like so-and-so married someone from another country, or married someone from a different social class or wildly different lifestyle. But most of the time, the people in our family are very similar to us. But even there, we often see people who disagree with us. And when we do that, I'm sad to see very often people say, that's a toxic relationship. You need to cut that person out of your life. And then when I see them describe what the toxicity is, it's not that they were abusing you. It's they said something that you didn't like politically. They said something you didn't like culturally. That is the ultimate, final, I think, end of a curated world, a self-curated world, where it's all we create is a narcissistic worship of ourselves. And so we become incapable of empathizing with other people. Okay, so how do we overcome this? We can't all do what I ended up doing, which is going into an intellectual world, which is completely at odds with who I am as a person. Completely is too big of a statement, but you get the sense of it, right? If we all did that, then this world would flip, and I would be in a world where everyone's like, oh, no, you're so right. No, you're so right. Instead, what we have to do in a conscious way is we have to seek out other opportunities to see what other people are thinking, what other people are doing. And a lot of people are going to immediately see this politically. And I mean this politically, but I also mean this culturally. I really like to go to other people's houses, and if they have like Netflix or Amazon Prime or one of these streaming services up, and they leave the room, I like to flip around and look at the recommendations they have, because they get different recommendations than I do. And I like to look for something which might interest me, but I'm not getting recommended. I'm an English professor, and one thing that every English major does is we're voyeurs of other people's books. But the wrong thing to do is to look at those books and judge them based on it. A better thing to do is look at those books and find the thing that interests them that you don't know anything about, and look into that. Every year when I go to Dragon Con, for example, people will say, like, what should I do for sure? What should I do? And I tell them one thing that I purpose to do every year, aside from the things I normally do, is I pick one thing that I don't know anything about, and I go to that and see it. And partly that's my own intellectual curiosity, but also I think it's good for me. It's good for me to learn to empathize with people who enjoy different things that I do, who see the world differently than I do, to come to see them as people, and maybe to present myself to them as people. In other words, I really seek to live an uncurated life in every way that I can, even while the tools of curation are all around me, even while I still know I'm gonna end up dealing with people who live in the same part of the world as I live in, and who are similar social class to me, et cetera, et cetera. I know way more professors than most people would know because of my job, and so that ends up being very influential on me. But I'm conscious of it, and I try to break that as much as I can. And so I want to recommend to everyone out there, whether you think I'm great or you think I'm terrible, right? Try to find people who you don't agree with in every arena, and seek out their thoughts. Try not to judge them immediately. Try to assume that they say the things that they say for good reasons. It might not be valid in the end. Okay, you might say, I still disagree with you. But when someone says something, you say, like, no one could ever think that. No one could ever like that. That's evil. That's stupid. If enough people think it might be evil or it might be stupid, but it's certainly arguable. And if you can't think of an argument for it, then your curated life is making you blind to the hearts of others. So this was a little more heartfelt than every time I wrote it. I intended it to be. Obviously, when I'm in class, I will berate my students for not doing their reading, et cetera, and I behave as if I'm not really sympathetic to them. But the truth is, I really am interested in what they have to say. I'm interested in what you have to say. And so if you think it's helpful to you to curate out of your life people and ideas that are at odds with what you already like, if you don't think that that's narcissistic, I want to hear that, and I want to hear the arguments for that. I want you to explain to me why I'm wrong, so I can understand really where you're coming from, even when you disagree with the very premise of what I'm saying here today.